Joining us now, a very special guest here in the studio, Toby Young, I mentioned earlier, the Associate Editor of The Spectator and founder of the Free Speech Union and the Daily Skeptic. Toby, great to have you here in Australia, have you here in the studio with us. A real privilege. You're here promoting the Free Speech Union, which is already doing great work. We had Celine against Baumgarten, Celine Against the Machine, on the show the other day, against all the nonsense of the e-safety commissioner. What have you learned since being in Australia? Is it what you feared it would be? Is it better or is it worse, Toby?
I think, Rowan, that the woke mind virus is slightly less evolved in Australia than in the UK. I think you're about 2 years behind us, so you've got some bad stuff coming your way.
Please.
But in some respects, you're ahead of us. So I'm here partly to try and not just to promote the work of the Free Speech Union of Australia, which is doing great work, as you say, but also to try and see what the future holds for us, because in some respects, you're ahead of us. So if I want to know what a Keir Starmer-led huge majority Labour government is going to do in the UK, I only have to look at the state of Victoria, the People's Republic of Victoria. So a conversion therapy ban, which happened in Victoria a few years ago, that looks like that's going to be brought in by Keir Starmer's Labour government. There's also, I think, a lesson for the Conservatives and Reform about how to work together and not cannibalise each other's votes by looking at the way the Liberal Party and the National Party have worked together, have a non-aggression pact in Canberra here. So that's also potentially a useful lesson.
So, Toby, let's talk about the British election. Farage got 5 seats, which was better than expected. You predicted 2 or 3. Other people were predicting 13 or even 18. So Nigel was predicting 18, I think, but as he should. What is going to happen in Britain? Massive majority for Labour. How scary is Keir Starmer?
I think he's pretty scary. He's a kind of, I think, the last gasp of technocratic managerialism. People have been portraying this as at odds with what's happening in the rest of Europe, on continental Europe, where we've seen a lot of insurgent, populist, right-wing parties do well in the recent European Parliament elections. Looks like they're going to do well in France on Sunday in the second election in France. And I don't think that what's happening in the UK is all that different. Only 20% of the population actually voted for Keir Starmer. It's the lowest number of votes polled of any winning majority, I think, since something like 1832. Wow. I mean, it's extraordinary. But we see the vote for the 2 main parties, the Uniparty, is lower than it's ever been, I think, since 2018. That's how I calculated it. Yeah, so it looks like there's a collapse in the technocratic managerialist approach that both parties have been embodying.
It may that the stats bear that out, but it's still going to be seen as a huge endorsement for Labor's policies. It's an enormous landslide. The 65% of the seats, I think they roughly hold. How do you think they're going to govern? Because when you look at some of the things there, senior people say who are going to hold powerful positions, you really do worry about what the UK is going to be like in 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, well, I guess the hope is that even though they have this super woke authoritarian agenda and they're going to unleash various assaults on free speech, not just a conversion therapy ban, probably a hate crime act in England and Wales to mirror that was passed in Scotland.
Quasi-blasphemy laws, it looks like.
Some kind of criminalisation of Islamophobia to placate these insurgent Islamist parties. But hopefully all this will be done with a Keystone Cops-like incompetence. Our Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, he makes Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary look like Palmerston. I mean, he's just astonishingly poor.
He literally thinks men can grow a cervix or have one implanted. I watched an interview with him.
We can't? What?
Not yet.
Rita,
apparently it's not
knock
possible.
me down.
Well, just on that note, all ladies out there, time for your prostate exam. Make sure you get that. But I just want to ask you, though, about, Rita mentioned Islamophobia a moment ago. It seems there's this really weird thing happening here in Australia, also in Britain, where you have a woke green left in politics, making alliance and common cause with people who, in any other circumstances, are the least woke and the least lefty of all. These people who are, firmly very much voting with the interests of the Islamic Ummah. They identify with that rather than necessarily their own electorate or the nation in which they live. Tell me what is happening here, and what is your take on, does this wind up, when you get these seats taken in Parliament, things are going to start to pull apart very quickly when these identity politics start to come into play, won't they?
Yes, I mean, it's a really worrying development in this general election campaign, the emergence of an ethno-nationalist voting bloc. And I say ethno-nationalist not because they're patriotic Britons. The country they're representing is Gaza. And that's really dangerous. We don't want a sectarian group being able to influence Labour Party foreign policy, not in Britain's national interest, but in the interests of a foreign state. Yeah. So that's deeply alarming. And it's odd, as you say. I mean, it's like teals in headscarves, queers for Palestine. What is it that they kind of, the Greenies and the Islamists have in common?
Hermes headscarves, just so you know. So they're Hermes headscarves that the teals wear.
OK, right. I guess it's, one thing that Lionel Shriver said is that the left choose their politics from the prefix-a menu. They don't distinguish between, LGBT rights and being pro-Palestinian. Somehow they're compatible because they're all on one side of the menu and they just pick the entire menu. They don't differentiate between different policies according to whether they actually are compatible.
Well, they've got the philosophy, my enemy's enemy is my friend, and that seems to be the basis of a lot of these allegiances, is they have a shared enemy in the Conservatives. But what do you see for conservatism in the UK? Because the Tories have been such an enormous disappointment. They have not governed like Conservatives. Do you see reform lasting and bringing in those disaffected Tories into the fold?
Well, they've certainly done an enormous amount of damage to the Conservative Party. And the reason the Conservative Party is down to 121 seats is because Reform fielded candidates in every single constituency. Whether there can be some kind of alliance, I think a merger is probably unlikely. Why? Because Nigel Farage will insist that if the parties merge, he's going to have to be the leader. Yeah. And there are going to be some Conservative MPs who balk at that prospect. And they've also got to worry about winning back some Conservative voters who went to the left, who defected to Labour and the Lib Dems. So if they merged with Reform, it might be difficult to win those defectors back. More likely, I think, is some kind of non-aggression pact, like the relationship between the Liberals and the National Party here, or perhaps some kind of organised
coalition. They're a formal coalition. So would they be able to live with that?
Well, I think if there's a non-aggression pact between Reform and the Conservatives in 29, when our next general election is due, and they each win enough seats to collectively form a majority government, then there could be a working coalition.
Toby, just quickly, tell us about the Free Speech Union, the successes you've had in Britain. We've covered many of them, Harry Miller and others we've had on this show over the years. But why is it so important for Australia? I've mentioned Celine's case, but what is the critical thing and how can people get in contact and why should they get in contact with the Free Speech Union here in Australia?
Well, the assaults on free speech in Australia are similar to the assaults across the English-speaking world. We now have free speech unions in New Zealand, in South Africa. We're hoping to get one set up in Canada. It's important, I think, to organise, to collectively fight back because the assault on free speech seems organised. It seems planned. So everything you're seeing in Australia, like the e-Safety Commission, we have a similar thing in England. We have our own Online Safety Act. In Canada, there's an online safety bill, which is even worse than what you have here. It looks like the federal government are considering a hate crime act that needs to be staunchly resisted. They're also considering an anti-misinformation bill. And we all know what misinformation means. It means any political point of view that I disagree with.
That's right.
So that needs to be heavily resisted. And it looks like The Free Speech Union of Australia is beginning to organise, is beginning to mobilise, and hopefully we'll be able to coordinate some of that resistance to these efforts
Fantastic.
to limit our God-given right to free speech.
Brilliant. Toby Young, thank you so much. And Toby's done such a brilliant job with the Daily Skeptic, with the Spectator, and of course with the Free Speech Union. You can contact them online if you've been cancelled or for any other reason that you feel your free speech is being impeded.